And the medieval world was a place of contradiction. It was harsh, brutal, and unforgiving, yet it held moments of freedom, spontaneity, and joy that modern life can barely imagine. People worked from sunrise to sunset, lived in cramped homes, and were constantly reminded of mortality. But within those constraints, life had its liberties. Villagers could wander freely, musicians could play in the streets, children ran without supervision, and the rhythms of daily life were guided more by the seasons than by rigid authority. Yet, for every freedom, there was always the looming possibility that one person, and through recklessness, ambition, greed, or simple misjudgment, could strip it away, changing life for everyone. In towns across Europe, and public spaces once belonged to the people. Markets thrived on chaos, laughter, and negotiation. Merchants set up stalls wherever they pleased. Children darted between legs, playing games that were as dangerous as they were exhilarating. Dogs ran through crowds, pigs foraged for scraps, and the smell of bread, roasting meat, and smoke filled the air. Villagers shared songs, stories, and gossip. There was a sense of collective ownership over streets, fields, and open spaces, and life was public in a way that seems unimaginable today. Music was perhaps the vivid example of this freedom. Minstrels traveled between towns, performing for anyone who would listen. People sang while they worked, danced at festivals, and clapped to the rhythms of drums and lutes. Music belonged to everyone, and rich and poor alike. But this liberty carried risk. One evening, in a bustling town square, a group of minstrels composed a satirical song mocking the local magistrate, and the lyrics were clever and biting, highlighting corruption, incompetence, and favoritism. The townspeople laughed, repeating the verses in markets, taverns, and homes, and the song spread faster than anyone anticipated. Authority, humiliated by public ridicule, could not tolerate it. The minstrels were arrested, and restrictions were placed on public performance. Instruments were banned from certain streets, songs required approval, and dancing became supervised. One song, and one act of daring humor, had reshaped the town's entertainment forever. Children, too, experienced freedoms that would be unimaginable later, and they roamed freely through fields and forests, climbed trees, and learned practical skills through play. They hunted small game, helped with chores, and participated in local festivals. Learning through observation and imitation was the norm. Until one accident changed everything, and a child wandered into a dangerous area near a river and drowned while the adults were distracted. Grief, anger, and fear swept the community, and authorities introduced strict limits on where children could go alone, effectively shrinking the world for generations. And one tragedy created regulations that curtailed natural freedoms. Hunting, another essential activity, was originally a communal practice. Villagers tracked deer, boar, and small game, using skill and knowledge passed down for generations. Forests were shared. Boundaries were flexible, but one misstep by a villager could devastate the collective freedom. A peasant hunted a stag belonging to a noble. Punishment was severe, but the consequence extended beyond the individual. Forests were now patrolled, common access restricted, and hunting rights became privileges reserved for the elite. And what one person did destroyed a centuries-old tradition for all. Food and drink, central to medieval life, were not immune to this pattern. Communal feasts and celebratory banquets and open marketplaces allowed villagers to share abundance, alleviate scarcity, and strengthen social bonds. And until a single extravagant feast ended in disaster, a wealthy merchant hosted a public banquet, wasting food and overindulging while a brawl broke out. A guest was killed, and authorities responded by limiting public feasts, controlling what could be served, who could attend, and when. Drinking was regulated, alehouses were restricted, and in one night of overindulgence reshaped social customs for decades. Even love and marriage, perhaps the most intimate aspects of life, were affected by one person's actions. Early marriages were often informal, recognized by community consensus. Love could form freely, and relationships were validated through intent rather than ceremony. until a man abandoned his partner, denying any bond and marrying someone wealthier, and the scandal embarrassed local authorities and the church, prompting stricter laws requiring formal ceremonies, witnesses, and records. And one selfish act transformed the way relationships were recognized for generations. Work and trade were similarly restricted through individual misbehavior. Craftsmen and merchants and laborers once moved freely between towns, setting up businesses selling goods and learning trades without formal permission. One rogue trader, however, and selling counterfeit coins or defective goods could bring ruin to entire markets. Guilds tightened regulations, apprenticeships were monitored, and permission became a requirement for all commerce. What had once been opportunity became obligation, and freedom became compliance. Movement itself, and something humans take for granted, was curtailed in the same pattern. Roads, rivers, and seas were once open, allowing people to travel for trade, pilgrimage, and/or relocation. One criminal could escape justice by crossing borders. One outbreak of disease could spread through unregulated ports, and one suspicious stranger could cause panic. Towns introduced gates, curfews, permits, and travel documents. Walking from one village to another, and once a simple act of daily life, became a regulated privilege. Speech, writing, and ideas followed a similar trajectory. Villagers once joked, debated, and told stories freely. Satire and criticism were part of daily life. One clever bard or writer could insult a lord, criticize governance, or inspire dissent, and the authorities' reaction was swift censorship, punishments, and regulation of speech and literacy. Ideas that had once moved freely became monitored, and letters were intercepted, performances were banned, and storytelling required permission. One voice silenced countless others. Even religion and spiritual practice, and the backbone of medieval culture, was subject to this cycle. Villagers adapted rituals to local customs, monks experimented with interpretations, and pilgrimages were once open. Until a monk's reinterpretation angered local clergy or one pilgrim stole sacred relics. Faith, once fluid and communal, became regulated, and rituals required supervision. Education in the church was monitored, and religious freedom diminished. One act of scandal reshaped devotion for entire communities, and entertainment, games, and social gatherings were also restricted. Festivals, fairs, and performances could unite entire towns. But accidents, theft, and/or conflict during these events led to bans, permits, and supervision. One performance mocking a noble or one fight at a festival could restrict social life for everyone, and music, dancing, and storytelling became conditional, dependent on approval rather than spontaneity. Even access to natural resources, forests, rivers, grazing lands, and followed this pattern. Villagers once foraged, hunted, and collected firewood freely. One overzealous hunter, one accident, one theft could provoke restrictions, and rangers patrolled forests, permission became mandatory, and open access vanished. Communities learned to fear their own environment. Tools, weapons, and implements, and essential for survival, were finally regulated. Axes, knives, plows, and hammers were once freely made, shared, and adapted. One apprentice's mistake, one stolen weapon, and one misused tool could lead to inspections, registrations, and prohibitions. Crafting, defense, and survival were controlled because of one person's actions, and the pattern of medieval life was relentless. Freedom existed. Joy, survival, and expression flourished. Then one person acted recklessly. Authority feared disorder, and restrictions followed. Every freedom, from music and dance to hunting, love, work, and even thought, could vanish because of one individual's choices. And by the end of the Middle Ages, the world that had once been fluid, communal, and spontaneous had become structured, regulated, and cautious, and people forgot that life had ever been free. They accepted rules as natural, unaware that centuries of freedoms had been lost one act at a time. And it was a world where one song, one accident, one scandal, or one misstep could change life for everyone. The medieval pattern was clear: freedom was fragile, and the consequences of a single person's actions shaped the lives of generations. Joy was conditional, survival was controlled, expression was limited, and trust, and once taken for granted, became the rarest commodity of all. In the medieval world, the concept of food, drink, and communal feasting was as much about survival as it was about social cohesion. Villagers, merchants, and nobles alike relied on the land, livestock, and seasonal abundance for sustenance, and the way people ate reflected their place in society. Bread, ale, and cheese were staples for everyone, and while meat and spices were symbols of status, markets bustled with activity, smells mingled in the air, and food was a form of currency, a gift, and a source of celebration. For many generations, this system worked with a kind of rough, informal freedom. People ate what they could find, shared with neighbors, and participated in feasts that brought communities together. This freedom, however, was fragile. One misjudgment, one act of excess, and one display of poor taste could reshape not only local customs but the lives of countless people. In one thriving town, for example, a wealthy merchant decided to host a public feast to celebrate the harvest. Long tables were laid in the central square, groaning under the weight of roasted meats, and fresh bread, and barrels of ale. Villagers, merchants, and even some minor nobility were invited to eat, drink, and celebrate, and what should have been a joyful gathering ended in chaos. A few of the wealthiest guests drank too much, arguments broke out, and food began to be wasted. By nightfall, one guest was injured in a scuffle, and the local authorities were embarrassed by the spectacle. The response was immediate. Laws were introduced limiting public feasts, and controlling who could host, and specifying what could be served. One excessive banquet had changed centuries of communal eating habits. Drink, particularly ale and wine, was both essential and dangerous. Water was often unsafe to drink, and fermented beverages were a safer alternative, consumed by men, women, and even children. And taverns were central to social life, serving as places to exchange news, negotiate work, and escape the burdens of daily labor. And yet freedom in drinking had limits that only became clear after incidents involving one reckless individual. In a documented case, an intoxicated patron verbally insulted a local tax collector in a busy tavern. The argument escalated into physical violence, a knife was drawn, and the tax collector was killed. The town responded not by blaming the individual alone, but by controlling the entire culture of public drinking, and tavern hours were limited, alcohol sales were restricted, and public drunkenness became punishable. The joy of casual drinking, once a communal ritual, became regulated and suspicious. Food preparation and consumption were not immune to the same pattern. Bread, the foundation of medieval diets, was closely tied to both survival and authority. Bakers were trusted to provide sustenance, and the poor depended on their skill. But one baker's greed, mixing inferior grain, reducing loaf size, or raising prices during scarcity, could trigger a crisis. When villagers fell ill from adulterated bread, authorities intervened, creating strict regulations on ingredients, weights, and baking practices. Inspectors were appointed, and small bakers struggled to survive under scrutiny. One greedy baker had transformed bread, a basic necessity, into a matter of legal control, and even the simple act of sharing food was not safe from scrutiny. During times of scarcity, generosity could be punished, and records indicate that one wealthy landowner distributed surplus grain to the poor, angering neighboring lords who feared the redistribution of resources. And authorities imposed limits on charitable distributions, specifying amounts and times for food sharing. What had once been considered kindness now required permission, and generosity itself became regulated. The rules extended to alcohol production and consumption. Brewing ale was traditionally a household task, often managed by women, and in taverns were informal spaces for socializing. One brewer, however, cheated by overcharging for low-quality ale and causing illness in patrons. And this isolated act sparked new regulations, licenses for brewing, supervision of taverns, and limitations on who could produce and sell alcohol. Women, who had once brewed freely, were excluded from professional production in some regions. One dishonest brewer reshaped the entire industry, and luxury foods were also tightly controlled. Spices, sugar, and rare ingredients arrived through trade routes from distant lands. They were expensive, coveted, and symbols of prestige. One merchant overstepped social norms by serving these ingredients at a public banquet, blurring class distinctions, and nobles felt insulted by a non-noble displaying wealth and influence. In response, authorities restricted the use of exotic spices to specific social classes and ensuring that status remained visible and unchallenged. One banquet had rewritten centuries of culinary freedom, and even the daily act of eating in private households could become a matter of law. In earlier medieval society, families could fast or feast according to personal choice, but when a prominent noble openly ignored fasting rules during Lent, eating lavishly while others abstained, authorities intervened. Penalties were imposed, and inspections were conducted, and fasting became legally enforced. Spiritual practices were weaponized to regulate what should have been a private act of consumption, and one nobleman's indulgence had forced compliance on countless families. Hunting for food was similarly restricted. Villagers hunted freely in forests and using skills passed down through generations. Deer, boar, and small game were vital for survival, and one peasant's illegal hunt of a noble's deer could prompt sweeping forest laws. Rangers were appointed, forests were divided, and commoners were forbidden from hunting freely. What one person did for survival became forbidden for all. Access to the land, once open and essential, was curtailed, and the medieval world operated on trust, yet trust was fragile. Communities depended on predictable behaviors, and in one act of dishonesty or excess could disrupt centuries of practice. Feasts, markets, taverns, and fields were all interconnected. A single banquet gone wrong, and a tavern brawl, a poisoned loaf of bread, or an overreaching display of wealth could ripple through a society and result in sweeping regulations. And authority learned quickly that control prevented chaos, and restrictions multiplied wherever one person caused fear or scandal. Even private celebrations were affected, and weddings, anniversaries, and household festivals were once casual and communal. One extravagant wedding where food was wasted, music disrupted the town, and disputes erupted among guests, prompted officials to regulate the number of attendees, what could be served, and who could host such events. And meals and celebrations became political tools, with every dish and every guest subject to scrutiny. This pattern extended to children as well, and young members of the community once played freely, ate wherever they liked, and even participated in preparing food. One tragic accident, and a child falling into a boiling cauldron of stew, or wandering into dangerous areas, could prompt laws regulating children's activities, their presence at markets, and even who could supervise them. Freedom to explore and learn about food trade and preparation was now conditioned on adult oversight, and the medieval pattern was relentless. Freedom existed, joy existed, and survival depended on practical knowledge and informal social norms. Then one person acted recklessly, and authorities, fearful of disorder, imposed restrictions. Generations of experience, shared knowledge, and communal joy were transformed into regulation, supervision, and compliance. By the end of the Middle Ages, what had once been a communal, open, and often chaotic system of food, drink, and celebration was tightly controlled, and markets required licenses, taverns had curfews, baking was monitored, alcohol was restricted, and celebrations needed approval. Social interaction around food, and which had been spontaneous and joyful, was now carefully mediated. People accepted these rules as normal, forgetting that one banquet, one fight, or one act of greed had rewritten the rules for everyone. In this way, the medieval world demonstrates the fragility of freedom, and alehouses were closed not because all patrons were irresponsible, but because one patron's behavior caused fear. Bread became regulated not because all bakers cheated, but because one baker had. Forests were closed to commoners not because all hunted illegally, but because one misstep threatened authority. Every restriction, every law, and every prohibition stemmed from a single person's actions reverberating through a society that depended on trust. Life in the medieval world was rich, vibrant, and alive, but it was also precarious. One mistake, one scandal, one act of indulgence or greed could transform centuries of communal life. Freedom in its many forms, feasting and drinking, cooking, hunting, celebrating, and even learning, was always conditional. It existed in the spaces between authority and community, always subject to disruption, and people forgot how open their world had once been. They accepted rules, restrictions, and limitations as natural, and not recognizing that every regulation had a history rooted in fear, scandal, and the actions of a single individual. In the medieval world, one person's choices could ruin it for everyone. And that is why, in the story of medieval food, drink, and feasting, joy and freedom were both abundant and fragile, and always subject to the unpredictable consequences of human behavior. The medieval world was once filled with freedoms that seem unimaginable today, and yet even the simplest liberties could vanish in an instant. One of the most overlooked areas of daily life was clothing, appearance, and fashion, and people dressed according to their means, their role in society, and sometimes even their whims. Peasants wore homespun tunics and rough woolen garments, and merchants displayed fine fabrics to signal wealth, and nobles adorned themselves with silks, furs, and jewelry to assert status. In small towns and villages, there were few restrictions. Tailors could experiment with designs, colors, and materials. Women could sew and wear patterns as they pleased, and children played in whatever clothes they had, sometimes patching, sometimes borrowing, sometimes wearing what had been rejected by older siblings. And it was a world of informal regulation, shaped more by custom and reputation than by law, until one incident changed everything. In one prosperous market town, a wealthy merchant's daughter began wearing a bright blue silk gown imported from a distant port. The color was rare, the fabric expensive, and the style daring, and her appearance drew attention, envy, and disapproval from local nobles. They argued that such an ostentatious display threatened social hierarchy, and as the wealthy merchant's family was not part of the aristocracy. Complaints reached the town council and eventually the regional lord. The result was swift, and laws were introduced dictating who could wear certain colors, fabrics, or jewelry. Sumptuary laws, as they came to be called, regulated clothing by class, and one person's choice in attire had imposed restrictions on the freedom of everyone else. Clothing was only the beginning. Hairstyles, personal adornments, and even shoes were subject to regulation. Women once freely braided their hair, decorated it with ribbons, or adorned themselves with pins and beads from local markets, and men wore hats of different shapes to indicate trade or origin. And until one scandal arose when a woman's elaborate hair ornament was interpreted a challenge to local customs and propriety. The authorities decreed what could be worn, and when, and by whom. Fashion, once an expression of personal taste, became a controlled signal of social order. Work attire followed the same pattern. Artisans, farmers, and laborers dressed for practicality. A blacksmith wore a leather apron, a farmer wore wool, and a weaver might use colorful threads for personal comfort. One journeyman, however, attempted to pass himself off as a master by wearing the garments and insignia of a guild he had not joined. His deception angered the local masters and guilds, and regulations followed, requiring guild-specific attire to be reserved for certified members. Work clothing, once practical and flexible, was now a sign of legal compliance, and even children's clothing was affected by such rules. Young boys and girls once dressed in whatever was available, often patched or repurposed garments. One child, in a minor but symbolic act, wore the wrong color during a festival and was ridiculed by the community, and authorities imposed restrictions on children's attire in public celebrations, insisting on uniformity to preserve social order, and the innocent freedom of play became regulated. Beyond clothing, the medieval world allowed informal education and apprenticeship in crafts, and Anyone could learn from their parents, neighbors, or traveling masters. One boy might learn carpentry from his father, another weaving from a neighboring woman, and another might experiment independently with ironworking. This informal system encouraged innovation and adaptation, and until one apprentice stole secret techniques from his master and sold them to a rival town. The breach of trust angered authorities and guilds, and prompting the creation of apprenticeship contracts, supervised training, and strict oversight. Freedom to learn and practice was now conditional, and one act of dishonesty reshaped education for all future apprentices. Food, too, played a role in this cycle of restriction, and people once had broad freedoms in preparing and consuming meals. Bread, ale, and seasonal produce were shared freely, and households had flexibility in cooking methods, and one overzealous chef or merchant, however, could disrupt the system. A baker who substituted inferior flour, a brewer who tainted all, or a merchant who hoarded supplies prompted regulatory intervention. Inspections, fines, and licenses became necessary. What had been a private and flexible system became a legal and public matter because one person abused trust. Hunting and access to natural resources followed a similar pattern, and forests were once open for villagers to gather firewood, forage, and hunt small game. Deer, boar, and fish provided nutrition, while berries and herbs supplemented diets, and until one poacher killed a deer reserved for a noble. Punishment extended beyond the individual, forests were patrolled, hunting rights restricted, and penalties imposed on entire communities. One act of disregard for ownership transformed centuries of communal access into monitored privilege, and social gatherings were also fragile. Festivals, fairs, and celebrations allowed villagers, merchants, and nobles to interact. Music, dancing, and storytelling brought joy and strengthened bonds and even resolved disputes. Yet one accident could change everything, and a festival in a major town ended in chaos when a dispute over food led to injury and property damage. Authorities responded by regulating attendance, performances, and even the types of games allowed. Public joy became conditional. One incident reshaped the way communities celebrated for generations. Speech and storytelling, and vital aspects of medieval life faced the same risks. Villagers once exchanged gossip, jokes, and tales without concern, and traveling bards and minstrels freely entertained towns and villages. One clever or audacious performer, however, could insult a noble or criticize local governance, and legal penalties, censorship, and oversight were imposed. Words that had once flowed freely became dangerous. One voice silenced countless others, and demonstrating how a single person's choices could limit the expression of an entire community. Religious practices, initially flexible and communal, were not immune, and pilgrimages, rituals, and local observances could vary according to tradition and circumstance, and until one monk or pilgrim acted in a way perceived as heretical or scandalous. One unauthorized ritual, one stolen relic, or one act of defiance could trigger supervision and bans and punishment. Spiritual expression, previously organic and community-based, became controlled by law and hierarchy. Even access to tools, weapons, and implements, and essential for work, survival, and defense, became regulated. Villagers once crafted axes, knives, plows, and hammers according to skill and need, and one apprentice's misused tool, one theft, or one accident could provoke regulations. Ownership, production, and use were now monitored, and what had been practical freedom became compliance imposed by fear of misuse. The pattern repeated endlessly. Freedom existed, one person abused it, and authority feared disorder, and restrictions followed. Music, fashion, food, hunting, work, education, speech, spiritual practice, and tools were all subject to this cycle, and one scandal, one accident, or one act of greed could shape law and social behavior for decades, and entire generations grew up accepting rules created to prevent the errors of one individual. By the end of the Middle Ages, freedoms that had once been fluid, communal, and spontaneous were heavily regulated. Clothing, work, education, entertainment, food, hunting, speech, and religious practices were no longer matters of personal choice, and social life, survival, and creativity were now monitored, licensed, or restricted. One person's actions had created restrictions that affected everyone, and communities adapted, normalized these rules, and forgot that life had once been freer. This is the story of medieval freedom and fragility, how joy, creativity, survival, and an expression were abundant, yet always conditional. One person could undo the liberties of thousands, and one misstep could create a legal or social restriction that lasted generations. Life was rich, vibrant, and alive, but also precarious. Trust was essential, and in one breach of trust could alter the world for everyone. And that is why, in the medieval world, freedoms were always provisional, and joy was always fragile. One act, and one mistake, or one scandal could change the rules forever. The medieval world was filled with freedoms and routines that, to modern eyes, seem astonishing. And one of the most overlooked aspects of life was trade and commerce. Villagers, merchants, and travelers depended on markets to survive, and goods flowed through towns along rivers, roads, and coastal ports. People bartered openly, negotiated deals, and sometimes traveled long distances with wares to sell, and money changed hands freely, and social interaction was woven into every transaction. Markets were not merely places to buy and sell, they were centers of communication and news, gossip, and entertainment. They were spaces of human connection, creativity, and spontaneity. Yet freedom in trade was fragile, and one person could disrupt the flow for everyone. Consider a traveling merchant who arrived in a bustling town with barrels of wine, sacks of grain, and exotic spices. And, for generations, merchants had worked together informally, respecting boundaries and agreements, often relying on trust rather than strict legal oversight. But this merchant had other ideas. He cheated local buyers, substituting spoiled grain for fresh, diluting wine to increase profit, and secretly selling goods in violation of local tolls. The deception spread quickly. Villagers became wary, local merchants lost money, and rumors of fraud reached the town council, and the authorities acted decisively. Licenses were required for all trade. Markets were monitored, goods inspected, and fines imposed on those who violated rules. What had been a fluid, flexible system became tightly controlled because one person had abused trust, and guilds arose from these kinds of incidents, attempting to regulate commerce and craft. They supervised apprentices, controlled who could sell goods, and set prices or production standards. Guild rules were strict, often forbidding innovation or experimentation, and one apprentice misused techniques or one merchant bypassed rules, and entire communities faced consequences. Knowledge, once freely shared, became monitored and licensed, and markets, once vibrant with freedom and negotiation, became structured, predictable, and heavily supervised. Travel for commerce was once flexible, but one person's actions could change everything. Roads connected villages, towns, and distant cities. Merchants moved with wagons, pack animals, or boats along rivers, and they carried coins, textiles, and food, relying on community trust and informal protection. Until one criminal or one dishonest trader stole goods from travelers or committed violent acts along a trade route. Authorities responded by building checkpoints, imposing tolls, requiring permits, and limiting who could travel. What had been a network of open commerce became a controlled system of surveillance, and the freedom to sell and buy across distances was now conditioned on approval. Even small markets were affected, and in a village where peasants sold surplus vegetables or handmade goods, one instance of cheating or theft could prompt rules requiring licenses for vendors, limiting hours, and creating fines for violations. Parents who had once allowed children to help in markets now faced restrictions. Informal systems of trust were replaced with paperwork and permissions and oversight. One act had restructured daily life. The production and sale of luxury goods also followed this pattern. Rare fabrics, imported spices, and exotic items were symbols of wealth and influence. When a merchant misused access to these goods, selling fake spices, adulterated silk, or counterfeit coins, and authorities stepped in. Regulations dictated who could sell luxury items, how they were to be stored, and who could purchase them. And displays of wealth were no longer purely social, they were monitored, restricted, and controlled. One act of dishonesty affected the entire system, and even lending and credit were subject to the same fragile freedom. Moneylenders have traditionally operated informally, extending loans to peasants, merchants, and even minor nobles. Trust and reputation were paramount, until one moneylender abused this trust, lending at exorbitant rates, collecting debts violently, or defrauding borrowers. The reaction was immediate. Laws were created to regulate lending, limit interest rates, and supervise moneylenders. And what had once been an informal system of credit became legally controlled because of one person's greed. Fairs and festivals, central to commerce, were not immune, and these gatherings allowed merchants, artisans, and farmers to meet and sell goods in a festive environment. But one theft, one violent argument, or one act of deception could provoke sweeping regulations. Guards were assigned, fines were established, and access became controlled. What had once been chaotic, open, and communal became predictable and constrained. Freedom of trade, like other freedoms, was contingent on the behavior of a single individual, and markets were also arenas for public communication. Town criers shared news, travelers exchanged stories, and merchants discussed prices and demand. One rogue speaker, however, could spread false information, incite panic, or defame someone influential. The result was restrictions on speech, monitored announcements, and control over what could be said in public marketplaces. Markets, once lively hubs of freedom and conversation, now had rules governing not just trade, but discourse itself. Even local economies could be reshaped by individual actions. A single merchant might corner a market, hoard essential goods, or manipulate prices to their advantage. Villagers and authorities, alarmed by potential starvation or social unrest, responded with regulations that restricted everyone's freedom to buy, sell, or trade. Markets became legal zones, and innovation or improvisation was limited, and freedom in commerce became conditional, based on compliance rather than skill or opportunity. Food supply, a critical part of commerce, was equally vulnerable. Grain, and the backbone of medieval diets, moved from farms to markets, towns, and cities. One dishonest merchant could misrepresent quality, divert shipments, or hoard grain during scarcity. Panic and outrage followed. Authorities regulated distribution, pricing, and quality, and what had been open access to necessary goods was now controlled for fear that one person's actions could threaten the survival of many, and trade was also tied to social identity. One scandal could change who could participate in certain markets, and a peasant selling luxury items meant for nobles could be punished, while nobles themselves enforced restrictions to preserve social hierarchy. And what one ambitious person did could enforce laws that constrained an entire community. Over time, freedom in commerce became a carefully monitored privilege, and merchants needed licenses, apprenticeships were formalized, roads were patrolled, markets were inspected, and rules dictated nearly every aspect of buying and selling. And generations grew up accepting restrictions that were originally designed to prevent chaos caused by a single individual. Trust, spontaneity, and flexibility, and hallmarks of early medieval trade, were replaced by bureaucracy, permits, and fear of abuse. The medieval pattern was clear: freedom existed, someone abused it, and authority feared disorder, and restrictions followed. Every aspect of commerce, markets, fairs, travel, trade, credit, and communication was shaped by this cycle, and one act of dishonesty, one reckless decision, or one violent incident could ripple across communities, creating laws and social norms that lasted generations. And by the end of the Middle Ages, commerce had become a structured, heavily regulated, and cautious activity. Markets were no longer spaces of spontaneous negotiation, and fairs were monitored, and trading privileges depended on authority approval. What had once been a world of trust and improvisation became a system of control and oversight, and one person's actions had changed the rules for everyone. This illustrates the fragile nature of freedom in the medieval world, and trade and commerce were not inherently dangerous, but they were vulnerable to human error and ambition. One rogue merchant, one violent dispute, or one dishonest act could reshape the social and economic landscape. Generations learn to comply with rules created for the mistakes of others, and often forgetting the spontaneity, trust, and freedom that had existed before. And that is why, in the medieval world, and even something as fundamental as trade and commerce could be ruined for everyone by the actions of a single individual. In the medieval world, communication was both simple and vital. Words carried weight, rumors traveled faster than couriers, and stories were as powerful as coins in shaping communities. And villagers, travelers, and merchants relied on informal networks of gossip, word of mouth, and public announcements to share news. Town criers shouted in marketplaces, and minstrels spread tales through song, and people relied on neighbors to pass information. There was a freedom in this system, and anyone with a voice could contribute to the flow of knowledge, influence opinion, and even challenge authority in subtle ways. And stories were not written down but memorized and shared, allowing ideas to spread quickly across towns, villages, and regions. Yet even this freedom was fragile, and one person's words could reshape the lives of countless others, and the consequences of speech were far-reaching. Consider a traveling minstrel and moving from village to village, performing songs that mixed humor, history, and commentary. And he arrived in a bustling market town and composed a song satirizing the local lord. The verses were clever, the audience laughed, and the song spread like wildfire. And by the next day, almost everyone in the town had heard it, and whispers traveled to neighboring villages. The lord, furious at being mocked publicly, and demanded immediate action. The minstrel was arrested, his instruments confiscated, and the town council decreed that public performance required approval. Music, which had once been a medium of community expression, became a controlled, monitored activity. One clever voice had imposed restrictions on the many, and even ordinary villagers were affected. People once told jokes, recounted stories, or shared warnings without fear of legal consequence. One villager, however, spread false rumors about a merchant cheating buyers, causing panic and distrust, and authorities responded by punishing the individual and creating rules restricting the dissemination of unverified information. Public speech, previously informal and communal, became a regulated activity. Trust, which had once been informal, was now enforced by fear of punishment, and letters and written communication were equally vulnerable. A scribe could freely write to friends, family, or patrons, until one scribe forged letters to manipulate inheritance, defraud others, or incite conflict. The act of one dishonest person led to supervision of correspondence, and restrictions on literacy, and requirements that letters be approved by authorities. What had once been private and free was now conditional and dependent on the integrity of the writer. Education and storytelling followed the same cycle. Children learned orally, apprentices absorbed knowledge from masters, and communities passed down wisdom through generations. One deceitful teacher, however, could mislead students, spreading incorrect knowledge or dangerous practices, and guilds, councils, and families introduced oversight, exams, and verification procedures. Learning, once fluid and communal, became monitored and restricted, and one act of malpractice reshaped education for everyone. Markets, too, were places of communication where words were exchanged freely. Merchants negotiated prices, and farmers warned each other of shortages, and travelers shared news of distant events. Until one individual spread false claims about the quality of goods and inciting panic or fraud. Authorities responded by restricting communication in marketplaces, monitoring announcements, and punishing offenders. Markets, once vibrant spaces of informal discussion, became regulated zones where words were controlled as carefully as coins or goods, and even spiritual guidance and religious teaching were vulnerable to misuse. Monks, priests, and lay preachers could once instruct villagers, explain rituals, or interpret scripture in ways that suited local traditions. until one preacher deviated from accepted doctrine, spreading heretical ideas or inciting conflict, and the reaction was swift supervision of religious instruction, approval for sermons, and legal consequences for deviation. And one person's speech reshaped spiritual freedom for entire communities. Public meetings, councils, and assemblies were similarly constrained, and villagers once spoke freely in local gatherings, debating issues of land, trade, or social matters, until one individual attempted to manipulate opinion for personal gain and causing disputes that escalated into violence. Officials responded by controlling who could speak, how decisions were made, and imposing strict oversight, and freedom to participate in governance was restricted because of one manipulative actor. Even personal expression in writing, art, and literature faced consequences, and manuscripts circulated among monasteries, merchants, and nobles. One author's controversial text, questioning authority or revealing secrets, could prompt censorship and book burning or stricter control of manuscript production. Knowledge and creativity, once freely shared, became regulated and monitored, and one controversial idea could silence countless others. Rumors and gossip, central to social life, were not exempt. Villagers used them to warn of danger, spread news, and/or entertain, until one rumor caused unnecessary panic, accusations, or violence. Authorities responded by punishing the source and creating rules for reporting news, and limiting casual communication, and imposing consequences for false claims. Informal freedom of speech, once taken for granted, became conditional, and even travel and movement were affected by the consequences of communication. Letters, verbal messages, and news could influence behavior across regions, and one traveler spreading false information could incite rebellion, theft, or distrust. Authorities established checkpoints, required identification, and monitored messages, and what had once been fluid movement became restricted because one person's words could affect many. The pattern was unmistakable. Freedom existed. Someone abused it, and authority feared disorder. Restrictions followed. Words, stories, songs, sermons, and gossip all followed the same cycle, and one person's choice could influence the rules for generations. Communities, seeking to protect themselves, accepted regulations as normal, and informal trust and spontaneous communication were replaced with fear and oversight. Even humor and satire were regulated. Minstrels, jesters, and performers could once critique nobles, question social norms, or poke fun at authority without fear, until one individual went too far and offending a powerful lord or religious figure. Performance was now conditional, requiring approval, supervision, and sometimes permission from multiple authorities, and freedom of expression was curtailed. One jest silenced countless others. Education, especially literacy, became regulated as well, and villagers once learned to read and write through informal mentorship or observation. One student used letters to commit fraud, forge documents, or mislead others, and authorities reacted by controlling who could learn, who could teach, and what materials could be accessed. Knowledge, previously open, became controlled, and one act of deception limited access for many. Religious festivals and rituals, previously opportunities for communal expression and storytelling, and were regulated when a scandal occurred. One misinterpreted ritual, theft of sacred objects, or disruptive act prompted laws restricting ceremonies and controlling participation and monitoring teachings. Freedom of communal speech in spiritual matters was curtailed because of one person's actions, and even private letters and correspondence became subject to surveillance. Nobles, merchants, and clergy once wrote freely to friends, family, and associates, and one forged letter or manipulated message could spark disputes, fraud, or political intrigue. Authorities imposed monitoring, censorship, and legal consequences, and freedom of private communication vanished due to the misdeeds of a single person. The pattern repeated endlessly. Freedom existed, someone abused it, and authority feared disorder, and restrictions followed. Words, stories, education, markets, gossip, sermons, and letters were all shaped by this cycle, and one careless act could ripple through communities, altering behavior and shaping law for generations. By the end of the Middle Ages, freedom of speech, communication, and knowledge was heavily controlled. Words, which had once flowed freely, were now scrutinized, censored, or punished. Storytelling, letters, and in public discourse depended on the approval of authorities. One person's actions could determine the limits of expression for entire communities. The medieval world, enriched in communication and social interaction, demonstrates how fragile freedom truly was. One rumor, one joke, one song, or one misused letter could create rules that restricted everyone. Communities accepted these regulations as normal, and forgetting that the liberty they experienced had once been spontaneous, communal, and informal. And that is why, in the medieval world, even the simple act of speaking and storytelling or sharing news could be ruined for everyone by the choices of a single individual. In the medieval world, and the concept of travel was both essential and dangerous. Villagers, merchants, pilgrims, and soldiers moved along roads, rivers, and coastal routes to trade, visit family, and fulfill religious duties or wage war. Travel was a daily necessity and a source of opportunity. People relied on informal networks for safety, guidance, and hospitality, and roads were filled with carts, pack animals, and foot travelers. Bridges and ferries allowed goods and people to move across rivers, and inns provided rest and sustenance along long journeys. For centuries, these systems worked on trust, custom, and the goodwill of local communities, and travelers respected local rules, and villagers offered shelter or guidance in exchange for courtesy, payment, or small favors. It was a delicate balance, and one maintained by informal agreements and social norms. Yet this freedom was fragile, and one person could disrupt it for everyone. And consider a merchant traveling with barrels of wine and sacks of grain. He relied on safe passage through villages and towns. But one merchant decided to cheat or steal, and taking goods from fellow travelers, bribing toll collectors, or spreading false information about safe routes, and his actions had consequences far beyond his immediate surroundings. Neighboring towns imposed checkpoints, required documentation for all travelers, and stationed guards along roads and bridges. What had once been a network of open travel became a controlled system, and one person's dishonesty reshaped freedom for thousands. Pilgrimages were particularly vulnerable. Pilgrims traveled to holy sites, sometimes hundreds of miles away, and seeking spiritual solace, indulgence, or guidance. They relied on the hospitality of monasteries, churches, and local villagers. One pilgrim, however, could abuse this system, stealing relics, extorting donations, or violating local laws. Monasteries responded by requiring documentation, supervising travelers, and restricting access to certain holy sites. Pilgrimages, once communal and informal, became regulated, and one individual's misdeeds limited spiritual freedom for countless others. And even casual travel for social or familial reasons faced restrictions when one person caused disruption. A young man traveling to court a bride might, intentionally or accidentally, trespass on private land, cause damage, or offend local authorities. And local lords and councils responded by creating strict guidelines for travel, specifying where people could go, when they could move, and under what conditions. And roads that had once been open to all were patrolled, tolls were introduced, and travelers needed permission to cross lands they had previously walked freely. And one act of disregard transformed the freedom of movement for entire communities. Merchants and tradespeople were especially vulnerable to restrictions, and trade required movement of goods across towns and regions. Until one trader falsified records, bypassed tolls, or smuggled prohibited items, and authorities implemented inspections, permits, and detailed record keeping. Freedom to conduct commerce depended on compliance, and innovation was limited, and one dishonest act could restrict trade networks for all. Even the movement of soldiers and militias was affected. Lords relied on militias raised from local villages, and soldiers traveled to fulfill military obligations. One soldier's misconduct, desertion, theft, or cruelty could prompt stricter oversight, curfews, or laws restricting movement. Entire communities were punished for the actions of a few. Roads and travel became monitored, controlled, and regulated to prevent repetition. And rivers and waterways, essential for transportation and trade, were also affected. Boats and ferries moved goods and people freely, until one boatman overcharged and stole cargo or transported contraband. Authorities required licenses, registered vessels, and monitored travel along rivers. And what had once been a simple system of transport became a controlled, bureaucratic process. One individual's misconduct transformed freedom for all who relied on waterways, and even seasonal travel for agricultural work was subject to restriction. Harvesters, laborers, and shepherds traveled to fields and pastures. One person stealing crops and harming livestock or violating local agreements could result in new rules controlling when and how people could move. Freedom to work across different lands, and which had been informal and based on trust, became legally regulated. Pilgrimage roads, trade routes, and village paths became heavily monitored. Guards were posted, and tolls were collected, and travelers needed documentation for passage. Inns and lodging were inspected, travelers' goods were checked, and local authorities held the right to detain those suspected of misdeeds. The freedom to move freely, once taken for granted, and had vanished due to the actions of a few individuals who abused trust. Even leisure travel was restricted. Nobles and villagers once enjoyed hunting trips, festivals, and fairs in neighboring towns, until one person caused conflict, poaching in a noble's forest, disrupting a festival, or committing theft, and authorities responded by limiting where people could go, introducing permits, and increasing oversight. Hunting grounds became exclusive, fairs were controlled, and paths that had been open to all became regulated. The pattern was consistent: freedom existed, someone abused it, authority feared disorder, and restrictions followed, and roads, rivers, fairs, pilgrimages, and work travel all fell under the same cycle. One reckless act could ripple across communities and reshaping behavior and law for generations. Communities, fearing chaos, accepted regulations as normal, and informal trust and spontaneous movement were replaced by fear and control. Even the simplest actions, like visiting a neighbor or traveling to a market, were affected, and one incident of theft or trespassing could create new rules for all travelers. Children traveling to fetch water or help in fields became subject to supervision, and one dangerous accident, falling into a river or being attacked along a road, led to oversight, patrols, and limits on freedom. By the late Middle Ages, freedom of movement was heavily curtailed. Travelers needed permits, roads were patrolled, tolls were enforced, inns were monitored, and access to lands required permission. One individual's misbehavior had created rules that governed everyone. Generations grew up accepting restricted travel as normal, and unaware that centuries earlier, roads, rivers, and paths had been far freer. Travel in the medieval world, like so many other freedoms, was a system of trust. One misstep, and one crime, or one act of greed could change the rules for everyone. Roads, waterways, inns, pilgrimage routes, and fairs became regulated spaces, and informal freedom was replaced with compliance, observation, and fear of reprisal. And that is why, in the medieval world, and even something as ordinary as moving from one village to another could be ruined for everyone by the actions of a single individual. In the medieval world, work and labor were not just necessities but identities. A person was known by what they did: farmer, blacksmith, baker, mason, weaver, carpenter. And skills were learned early in life, passed from parent to child, master to apprentice, neighbor to neighbor. Work was not strictly regulated at first, and people helped each other during harvests, borrowed tools, learned by watching, and practiced skills long before anyone gave them permission. And survival depended on flexibility, cooperation, and shared knowledge. The boundaries between trades were loose, and necessity often mattered more than rules. This freedom, however, rested on trust, and trust could be broken by a single individual. In one growing town, a man trained informally as a carpenter began taking on work meant for master builders. He offered cheaper prices, worked quickly, and attracted many customers. At first, and people welcomed him. But one poorly built structure collapsed, injuring several residents. Panic spread through the town, and the question was no longer about one man's mistake, but about safety, order, and authority. Town officials intervened, and declaring that only approved masters could perform certain kinds of work. Apprenticeship became mandatory. Years of supervised training were required, and what had once been open learning became restricted because one person worked beyond his skill. The same pattern appeared across trades. Blacksmiths had once forged tools and nails, horseshoes, and household items freely. Villagers relied on them for survival. But when one smith produced faulty weapons or tools that broke under stress and causing injury or death, authorities stepped in. Smiths were required to join guilds, register their work, and submit to inspections. Innovation slowed, and experimentation became risky. One defective blade reshaped an entire profession. Bakers faced similar consequences. Bread was life itself, and a single baker who mixed inferior grain, used unsafe additives, or reduced loaf size during shortages could spark outrage. When illness or hunger followed, and officials responded with strict rules. Bread weights were standardized, baking times were regulated, inspectors were appointed. Small home bakers struggled to comply, and one act of greed turned bread making into a controlled occupation. Women in particular felt the impact of these changes. Many medieval women brewed all, spun wool, and baked bread, and sold goods informally. One dishonest brewer who diluted all or overcharged customers could trigger licensing requirements, and brewing shifted from household practice to regulated trade, often excluding women altogether. One person's deception removed economic freedom from many others, and farm labor was not immune. Peasants once worked fields collectively, sharing labor and tools. During harvest, neighbors helped neighbors. But one individual stealing crops and damaging shared land or violating agreements caused disputes. Lords imposed stricter oversight, fields were divided. Shared labor became monitored, and communal trust weakened. One theft reshaped rural life. Even healing and medicine followed this pattern. Folk healers, midwives, and herbalists practiced freely and relying on experience and tradition. When one healer caused harm through negligence or false remedies, authorities intervened. Healing became regulated, and practices were restricted. Women healers were pushed out or punished. One failure cast suspicion on an entire tradition of care, and apprenticeship itself became controlled because of betrayal. One apprentice stole techniques, tools, or trade secrets from a master and sold them elsewhere, and guilds reacted harshly. Contracts became binding. Movement between masters was restricted. Learning became confined, and one act of disloyalty reshaped education for generations. Labor mobility also suffered. Workers once traveled to find seasonal work, construction projects, and/or better opportunities. One worker committing theft or causing unrest in a new town could prompt travel restrictions. Workers needed letters of permission, and towns monitored newcomers. Opportunity became conditional. One criminal act reduced freedom for countless laborers. Even tools were affected. Axes, hammers, chisels, and knives were once shared freely. When one worker used a tool as a weapon or caused injury through misuse, authorities imposed restrictions. Tools had to be registered, and ownership was questioned. What had been symbols of productivity became objects of suspicion. The medieval workday, once guided by necessity and daylight, and also became regulated. One labor dispute, one act of sabotage, or one refusal to work could trigger imposed schedules, fines, or punishments, and lords and councils tightened control. Labor became obedience rather than cooperation. The pattern repeated endlessly. Freedom existed. One person abused it, and authority feared chaos. Restrictions followed. By the late Middle Ages, work was no longer simply about skill or survival. It was about permission, and guilds controlled who could work. Lords controlled where labor happened. Councils controlled how tasks were performed, and people accepted these systems because they promised safety and order. Few remembered that work had once been flexible, shared, and open, and children grew up knowing only regulated labor. They learned that trades required approval, that tools were controlled, that knowledge was guarded, and they did not know a time when learning came naturally through observation and necessity. One person's mistake had become everyone's limitation. Work, and once a source of pride and independence, became a system of control. Innovation slowed. Creativity narrowed. Survival became dependent not only on skill, but on authority's permission. And that is why, in the medieval world, and even the simple act of working with one's hands could be ruined for everyone by the actions of a single individual. In the medieval world, play, entertainment, and leisure were not luxuries reserved only for the rich. Despite hard labor and constant uncertainty, people found time to enjoy themselves, and games were played in village squares, children raced through streets, adults gambled with dice, wrestled for fun, and gathered to watch performances, and festivals broke the monotony of daily life, offering music, dancing, contests, and laughter. Leisure was informal, spontaneous, and deeply woven into community life, and it required no permission, no license, and no oversight. People played because they were human, and joy was necessary for survival. This freedom, however, was fragile, and in one town, a group of young men gathered regularly to gamble with dice outside a tavern. At first, it was harmless fun. Coins passed hands, laughter echoed, and passers-by paused to watch. Over time, one player began cheating, disputes erupted. Accusations turned into violence. One night, a knife was drawn, and a man was seriously injured. The incident shocked the town. Authorities did not focus solely on the cheater or the attacker. Instead, they banned public gambling entirely. Dice games were outlawed, fines imposed, and guards assigned to enforce the ban. And what had once been a simple pastime vanished because one person crossed a line. Games of strength and competition faced similar consequences. Wrestling, stone throwing, and archery contests and mock battles were popular among young men. These games sharpened skills useful for war and hunting. But when one contest turned deadly, and when a competitor was seriously injured or killed, officials intervened. Competitions were restricted, rules imposed, and in some cases, banned altogether, and play that once strengthened communities became a source of fear. Children felt these restrictions deeply. Medieval children once roamed freely, inventing games and climbing structures, playing near rivers, and learning through exploration. One tragic accident, a child falling from a wall, drowning, or being injured during play, and could change everything. Adults, consumed by grief and fear, demanded action. Authorities restricted where children could play, required supervision, and banned certain games. Childhood freedom shrank. One accident reshaped generations of upbringing. Festivals, once the heart of medieval joy, also suffered, and annual celebrations marked harvests, religious holidays, and seasonal changes. Entire communities gathered to sing, dance, drink, and forget hardship for a while, but festivals were unpredictable. One drunken fight, one insult to a noble, or one theft during a celebration could spiral into chaos. When a festival ended in violence, authorities responded by limiting attendance, restricting music, controlling alcohol, and supervising celebrations. Joy became conditional, and one night of disorder reshaped community traditions. Street performers were among the first to lose freedom. Jugglers, acrobats, musicians, and storytellers once performed wherever people gathered. Their performances were informal, relying on donations and goodwill. When one performer offended a noble, mocked authority, or incited unrest, the response was swift. Public performances required approval. Certain acts were banned. Instruments were confiscated, and one performer's boldness silenced many others. Even dancing became regulated. Dancing was once a natural expression of joy, part of festivals and social gatherings, and when one dance turned inappropriate in the eyes of religious authorities, or when a gathering led to scandal, restrictions followed. Dancing was limited to specific times and places or occasions. What had been spontaneous expression became a monitored activity. Sports and games involving animals also faced bans. Bear baiting, cockfighting, and animal races were popular forms of entertainment. But cruelty, injuries, and public outrage followed incidents where animals or spectators were harmed, and authorities banned or restricted these events. Entire traditions vanished because one incident crossed a boundary of tolerance. Music, once woven into daily life, and faced scrutiny as well. Villagers sang while working, children learned songs from elders, and music accompanied rituals. One song with controversial lyrics and one melody associated with unrest could prompt censorship. Music required approval. Instruments were regulated. One song changed the rules for everyone, and alcohol-related entertainment suffered similarly. Drinking games, tavern songs, and social gatherings were central to relaxation, and one drunken brawl or fatal accident led to curfews, restricted hours, and limits on tavern activities, and social spaces became controlled environments rather than places of freedom. The medieval pattern repeated itself. Freedom existed. One person abused it, and authority feared chaos. Restrictions followed. Leisure was no longer free. Play required permission. Joy required oversight, and entertainment became regulated not because everyone behaved badly, but because one person's actions created fear. Over time, communities internalized these restrictions, and children grew up knowing which games were forbidden. Adults learned which songs not to sing, which dances to avoid, which gatherings required approval, and people forgot that joy had once been spontaneous. Even private celebrations became cautious. Weddings, birthdays, and household gatherings were scaled down, monitored, and or limited. Laughter became quieter, music became softer. The fear of punishment overshadowed joy. Leisure, once a source of resilience and unity, and became another aspect of control. Authorities justified restrictions of protection, but the cost was high. Communities lost traditions, creativity, and shared happiness, and in the medieval world, survival was hard enough. Joy made it bearable. Yet even joy was fragile. One fight, one accident, one scandal could erase centuries of tradition. And that is why in the medieval world, even the simple act of playing, celebrating, or enjoying life could be ruined for everyone by the actions of a single individual. And in the medieval world, privacy barely existed, yet personal life still carried a surprising amount of freedom. Love relationships, marriage, and family were shaped more by custom and community than by strict law. People met at markets, festivals, wells, and fields. Courtship was informal. A promise and a shared household or community recognition was often enough to define a relationship. Marriage could be simple, personal, and flexible. Families negotiated arrangements, but affection and mutual agreement still played a role. For ordinary people, love was lived openly and imperfectly, guided by tradition rather than paperwork. This freedom, and like so many others, rested on trust. In one village, a man publicly promised himself to a woman, lived with her, and was treated by the community as her husband. And years later, when wealth became an opportunity, he denied the bond entirely and married someone else. The abandoned woman appealed to local authorities, and the scandal spread beyond the village. The church and local officials responded decisively. Informal marriages were no longer trusted. Ceremonies became mandatory, and witnesses were required. Records were kept. What had once been personal became institutional. One betrayal reshaped marriage for generations, and courtship itself came under scrutiny. Young people once met freely, spoke openly, and formed bonds through shared labor and celebration. One secret relationship, and discovered after it caused family conflict or violence, provoked outrage. Authorities imposed curfews, restricted gatherings, and supervised interactions between unmarried men and women. Freedom to choose affection gave way to oversight. One scandal altered social behavior for entire communities, and family structure was similarly affected. Extended families often lived together, sharing space, food, and labor. Boundaries were flexible, and until one dispute over inheritance turned violent. Accusations, forged claims, and family betrayal led to legal intervention. Inheritance laws became strict, and property transfer required documentation. Family arrangements were no longer informal. One act of greed transformed household life into a legal matter, and even childbirth and parenting were reshaped by individual failures. Midwives once operated freely, guided by experience and trust. One tragic birth, and mishandled through negligence or misinformation, caused fear and outrage. Authorities imposed controls on who could assist births. Midwives were monitored, restricted, and/or replaced. Women lost autonomy over one of life's most intimate experiences. One mistake reshaped generations of care. Children's upbringing also changed, and children once worked, played, and learned within the community. One case of abuse, neglect, or exploitation prompted restrictions. Authorities intervened in family life and regulating labor, guardianship, and discipline. What had been private became supervised. One act of cruelty narrowed freedom for countless families. Sexual behavior, and once governed mostly by community norms, became regulated as well. One scandal involving a powerful figure or religious authority prompted sweeping moral laws, and relationships were monitored. Punishments were imposed. Fear replaced discretion. One public offense reshaped private behavior. Even grief and death were not immune, and funerals were communal affairs, informal gatherings where mourning was shared openly. One funeral turned into disorder, arguments over inheritance, public drunkenness, and/or violence. Authorities responded by regulating funeral rites, limiting attendance, and controlling rituals. Even mourning became conditional. The home itself, and once a private refuge, became subject to control. One household accused of harboring criminals, fugitives, or forbidden relationships led to inspections and surveillance, and privacy diminished. Homes were no longer entirely safe from authority. One act of secrecy reshaped domestic life. Marriage across social classes also faced restriction, and love sometimes crossed boundaries of wealth and status. One controversial union angered elites who feared loss of hierarchy, and laws were introduced restricting who could marry whom. Personal choice yielded to social control. One marriage narrowed freedom for countless others, and widows and widowers once held significant autonomy. A widow could manage property, remarry, or live independently, and one widow accused of mismanaging land or influencing others improperly caused backlash. Restrictions followed. Independence was curtailed, and one case reshaped expectations for all. Even friendship faced suspicion. Close bonds between unrelated individuals could provoke gossip or fear, and one friendship perceived as conspiratorial or dangerous resulted in restrictions on gatherings and private meetings. Social trust weakened, and the medieval pattern persisted relentlessly. Freedom existed. One authority feared disorder. Restrictions followed. Over time, love became contractual, and marriage became legalistic. Family life became regulated. Child rearing became supervised. The personal became political, and what had once been guided by trust and tradition was now governed by rules and fear. People adapted. They learned when to speak, whom to meet, how to behave, and intimacy became cautious. Affection became measured. Relationships were shaped not only by emotion but by compliance.